doesn't use the word rights, but the very first words of her prologue when she tells her tale, and we can contrast her tale with the knight's tale. She says,
or the prologue,
in the prologue to her tale, it's a long prologue, the wife of Bath blabbers all over the place. The knight doesn't say a word. All he does is tell his tale. He's a man of very few words. But the wife of Bath is loquacious, and she says, these are great lines, experience, though non auctorite were in this world, is richt enough for me. Now we can just take those that line. Experience, even though there was no such thing as any authority in the world, would be right enough for me. Well,
there's right.
There's right. I
used in a different sense.
In a different sense, although it would include it. It's an analog.
Yeah, it is. It's in the same family.
And she, of course, then applies it in the next line to marriage specifically. But the wife of Bath is the great proponent of experience over authority. Oh dear, that word experience is, that's a modern word. We talk about experimental science. That is, experiment comes from the same word. Experiment over tradition, over authority. Whole revolt of the Renaissance was a revolt against authority, against things that had been received. The knight, and this is marvelous, isn't it? That is, let's set the wife of Bath up against the knight. Which of them has had the most experience? You just laugh the minute you raise the question. The knight, I suppose you would say, using the word in its ordinary sense, has had more experience than anybody on the whole pilgrimage. The 9 and 20 of a company, the knight has been around the world 10 times over.
That's what's stressed in the description of the knight, where he has been and what he has done.
Remember Odysseus? At the beginning of the Odyssey, Homer says of him that he was exactly the same thing. He reduces it to a single word. Polytropos.
Well-traveled, it's hard word to translate. Well-traveled is one of the man of the many turnings, literally, polytropos just means the man of many turnings. Well, the knight is like that. He's had a very long experience of the world. And he doesn't talk about it.
No, he doesn't.
He doesn't say anything about it. Whereas the wife of Bath has had a very narrow experience, and it's all focused on one thing, and that's marriage. Her husband.
She's had a lot of
them. So that's what she means by having a lot of experience.
Yeah, she has. I mean, you can't get rid of the wife of Bath. There she is. You can't shut her up. She'll always appear, although she is just awful. She is just absolutely awful, and she doesn't know anything. With this experience, she's had 5 husbands. She cites the Bible. She cites remember when our Lord meets the Samaritan woman at the well, and he's thirsty, and he says, "Give me to drink," and she does, and then he says, "Now the husband that you have now is not your own," and the woman is struck dumb with amazement that our Lord would see into her soul like that. And the wife of Bath makes a heroine. No, she said, no, there's the Bible. That Samaritan woman, she was right, and our Lord was wrong. I mean, she really, in her interpretation of the Bible, goes against authority, and makes the idea of having a lot of husbands is a very good thing. But I was saying that really, she doesn't know anything. At the end of this long prologue, and it's longer than her tale, it's longer than most of the tales, it just goes on and on and on. I don't know, it must have these lines somewhere underlined. Oh gosh, I don't remember now where they are, but she talks about herself, and she says, well, I've lived a long life, and I can't find the lines, my eye is bad today, but she says, I've had a long life, and I've learned everything from experience, and I'm still, she says, I'm still beautiful and young. And she's a horror. She's sort of like Elizabeth Taylor. You when you go through the supermarket traffic lines to have your groceries rung up at the cash register, they display these magazines with lurid covers, and Elizabeth Taylor is still on the covers of those magazines, wearing her diamonds, and her face has been lifted for the 100th time. It's grotesque. I mean, she's grotesque. She's my age, and she's still saying, "But I'm beautiful and young." And she isn't. That's the wife of Bath. It's a grotesque thing, and it isn't true. Gee, I wish I could find those lines, because he does sum it up so beautifully, but for some reason I just didn't.
No, I can't find it either.
You check those things. One of the things about teaching is we use different books over the years, and you mark one and you don't mark the other.
Well, you mark all of them.
Finally, it's so good you get them all marked. Well, you young people, you read through that thing and you'll find those lines, and when you do, you'll be struck again at how brilliantly Chaucer tosses them off through the mouth of the wife of Bath.
She's full of a kind of false learning. She's full of information. She's picked it all up somewhere. She's picked it up at church. She's probably illiterate, which is common enough. For all I know, the knight is illiterate. That's not the point. It's just that she's picked all this up, little snippets of everything, and she's turned it all to her own use. So she has all the sound of being an educated woman, and she is not an educated woman, absolutely not at all an educated woman.
No, the prioress is an educated woman.
Yes, the prioress is an educated woman. The knight is an educated man, though not a learned man. But the wife of Bath is a deeply ignorant woman, if you can use that term.
But she's smart.
Yeah, but she's very, very clever.
She's clever in business. She inherited a business from one of those husbands, and apparently is very wealthy, for example.
Well, she cheated every one of them out of their. That's why she married them, was to get their money in the beginning to start with. She married all but one. She married for their money.
And then when she had the money, there she was marrying them for what she had missed all her life. Yeah. And he was only about 20 years old.
Yeah.
She was 50. She is one of the great. I had used the word grotesque. It's not true. I take it back. Elizabeth Taylor is grotesque, but the wife of Bath isn't. She's still human, isn't she? I mean, she's still within the limits. I mean, she didn't have her face lifted. I mean, that's grotesque. No. That's grotesque.
Yeah.
No, she went around dressed in clothes trying to make herself look younger, and she might have put a little lipstick or something. I suppose they did.
They had.
They had makeup,
because the church was always inveighing against it.
So the preachers was vanity. But I do think I would have to say a word like grotesque is a Renaissance and post-Renaissance word. There is no such thing as anything really grotesque in Chaucer. There are things that are exaggerated and that are like a cartoon. But now I have to look it up in the dictionary to make sure that I'm right about this. I'm using the word grotesque in a kind of an occult, supernatural sense. It has about it the smell of black magic and things like that.
It comes from grotto, from some kind of from a cave or some sort of underground place. It's dark. There's something.
Wouldn't it mean Faust to those
dark.
sort of like elixirs and chemicals and
the artist that comes to mind is Doré,
yes,
the French writer, illustrator. He is a grotesque artist, and his if you've ever seen anything done by Doré, and you close your eyes, you will have the impression of a dark scene full of distorted figures. Probably they look like they're probably in hell. They're underground.
There's something diabolic about it. There's something that smacks of alchemy. Uncanny is another word we sometimes use. And again, I don't know. Uncanny probably means unhuman. Canny probably comes from ken.
Know something you know, and uncanny is
Yeah.
something unknown.
Yes,
the
it's that-
unknown.
the mysterious and
Yeah.
the unknown. Yeah. In Chaucer, we get a touch of that. We shouldn't overlook it. There's one character who was not on the pilgrimage, who intrudes into the pilgrimage, and he is an alchemist. He's a canon of a church. He's a clergyman, but an evil clergyman, and he's driven away. The pilgrims won't accept him. He practices alchemy, and he has with him a yeoman. He's called the canon's yeoman, and the canon's yeoman tells the pilgrims what this canon is. He rats on them, and the pilgrims drive him off. I remember one critic saying, one of the famous critics in Chaucer saying that it may be, that the canon is the only one in the whole of Chaucer who goes to hell. That is, he's not on the pilgrimage. He's driven off, and he slinks off into the dark, into the woods, in shame, because of this filthy evil that he practices. Now the yeoman stays with the crowd. In fact, he has a tail. I can't remember.
Yeah, the yeoman.
Canon's yeoman.
I don't remember the
forgot. Yeah, probably has to do with alchemy or something. But he's a healthy man who had been simply forced into the service of this evil man. So there's one character who might have touched on the grotesque in Chaucer, but that's the only one. So the wife of Bath is a perfectly healthy woman, and she's on the pilgrimage, and most of us, alas, there we go with that great word. Most of us, alas, are going to have to contend with her in purgatory for a long, long time. She's going to be there, and we're going to say, "Oh, I can't stand this anymore. Please, won't someone on earth pray me out of this circle?" Because I think she presides over one of the circles of purgatory. If Chaucer had written Dante's Purgatory, he would have had a circle of women like that. You meet them. I took an airplane trip just a few weeks ago, and I sat next to a woman, and right away she started to talk to me. She was a Christian Scientist. Well, by golly, she was the life of Bath. I mean, it was something like, I won't say she was, but there it was, and there's nothing you can do. I mean, you're trapped in an airplane, and there she is, and all those opinions and all those arguments, and you can't refute them. There's no way to refute. But there she is on the journey. We're going to have to accept her. She's marvelous. I mean, in a way, you end up quoting the life of Bath. And there's a lot of truth, of course, in what she says.
She is often compared to Shakespeare's, what many people would call Shakespeare's greatest comic character, Falstaff.
Mm-hmm.
Falstaff is contemptible in many ways, but in every way, I suppose you would say. He's a liar and a cheat, coward. There's all. He has no virtue that you could mention at all, except he's very witty. He's very clever. He's a lot like the wife of Bath. He's a great talker, like the wife of Bath.
What would happen if they met? Dialogues of the dead. Wouldn't that be something?
Yes.
The trouble is, you'd have to have Chaucer or Shakespeare write it. You couldn't do it.
No. But they do have. It's a fair comparison. It's a perfect comparison.
Oh, that's a good one.
Because they're so alike. It's especially insofar as there is some great attraction in them. They're irresistible, I guess, is the word you use. They're irresistible. For all that you admit all their faults. You say yes, it's true. There's no defense of them possible, and yet there is. They have tremendous vitality. For example, both
full of life.
Just full of life, And that, after all, Sam Johnson says, well, that's the test of poetry. He says, how much life does it have in it? He says that's how you decide whether a poetic character is a great character. And it's very hard to find any character who has as much life in him as Falstaff does, or as the wife of Bath.
For the modern reader, she runs off with the poem. I know most modern professors who teach in universities and colleges, most of them will take her as the greatest character in the whole.
Oh, yeah.
They talk about her more than anything else.
Yeah.
And of course, they agree with everything she says.
Yeah, well, they agree. But even if you don't agree with her, you end up talking a lot about her.
Oh, and she tells a good tale.
Yeah.
A whopping good tale, too.
Yeah.
It's a tale of romance. Well, it surprises everybody. It's an old-fashioned tale of romance, but of course it has as its meaning that women must have the souverainy tale. One of the greatest speeches that the wife of Bath speaks is the great speech on poverty, where she attacks authority and she attacks the whole medieval order of society. We were talking last time about hierarchy and subsidiarity. She is a Renaissance woman. She really is. She's no learned person, but there isn't a philosopher from Machiavelli through Hobbes to John Stuart Mill who has ever expressed it better. That is, if you want to talk about the modern spirit of political independence, if you want to talk about liberty, equality, and fraternity, you will not find anybody who has ever said it better. She attacks what she calls gentilessa, a thigh on it, she says. And her argument is, in the days of Adam and Eve, there weren't any lords. There weren't any gentry. There weren't any gentle folk who were the lords, and then we were the lower classes. She is really very eloquent. Glad poverty. She calls it glad poverty. Glad poverty is an honest thing, certain, she says. It's one of the famous lines.
This is in her
tale, the end of her
itself. This is
tale,
the lady in the tale.
The old witch.
The old woman who has forced the young knight to marry her. She lectures him because she says, well, you're rejecting me because I'm not beautiful, and because I'm old, and because I'm poor. Those are your reasons for rejecting me. And then she lectures him on those qualities.
But for ye spaken of switch gentilesse, as is descended out of old richesse, that therefore shoulden ye be gentlemen, switch arrogance is not worth a hen. She says, gee, that's so good. Nobody could say that better. And then she calls on Christ. Look, who that is most virtuous alway, privy and apart, and most intendeth to do the gentle deeds that he can, talk him for the greatest gentleman. Christ will we claim of him our gentilesse, not of our elders for her old richesse. Well, come on now, there's many a Methodist preacher who's done nothing more than expand for the rest of his life sermons on those lines from the life of Bath. It's false, but it's a very attractive theology. That is, Christ, you hear it all over the place today, even in the Catholic Church, at least among people who are not respectable, but they're still in the Catholic Church, that is the so-called liberation theologians. That's exactly what they're saying. That is, they're saying that Christ preaches the equality of man. That Christ is called the liberator. You hear that all over the place. Who was the fellow from Mexico, Father. Unfortunately, I've forgotten his name, so we won't put it on the tape. But the famous leader of the liberation theology movement, that's exactly what he says. He says Christ liberated us, came to liberate, free us from hierarchy. That's really what he's saying. And that's what the life of Beth is saying. You can't be proud of your ancestors. You can't take credit for what they did. The only aristocracy is the aristocracy of deeds, of action. Is what have you particularly done that would deserve praise? I've heard that preached recently on the radio in praise of the French Revolution. That is, that whole idea of liberty and equality and fraternity. That is, just because your ancestor was the Duke of something or other, that doesn't mean that you're anybody. You have to prove the only aristocracy is your particular personal virtue. And there's nothing in family, there's nothing in tradition, there's nothing in authority. Every man equally for himself. Well, that's the wife of Bath, and there she is preaching that doctrine in 1390. There was a movement in England which was one of the earliest of the Protestant movements. They were called Lollards, and I've forgotten why. Do you remember why? They were followers of Wycliffe, a man named Wycliffe who was a heretic. As Wycliffe preached what today we would call the social gospel of liberation. That's what he preached. And he had a tremendous following among the disaffected city classes. Well, it's a long story. We're not in the business of teaching history.
It's a famous little couplet on Adam delved and Eva spun, who was then the gentleman.
Right, and that was a Lollard slogan.
That was a Lollard slogan.
See, that's a great one.
Yeah.
When Adam delved, that means plowed.
Yeah, right. He dug
in the ground. When Adam delved and Eve span, that is spun the wool off, who was then the gentleman? That's exactly what the wife of Bath said. And many people have said, well, the wife of Bath had probably listened to Wycliffe himself. She might very well have. She certainly would have been one of his supporters. He had a church, as it were, a sect. He was condemned. I don't know. I've forgotten. Was he? What happened to Wycliffe?
I think he.
Did he die an ordinary death?
Yeah,
this is before the days of burnings at the stake and all that kind of stuff.
No,
I suspect he just died, but he was condemned. He was officially condemned by the Catholic Church as a heretic.
Violent attacker of the church.
Yeah. He was a priest, I guess. I think he must have been. Probably was an ordained priest.
He translated the Bible.
But again, that's another one.
Yeah.
That's another one.
Yeah.
That is the Bible. See, again, we don't accept the Bible on the authority of the church. The Bible is a liberator. It's a document, and we're going to read it for ourselves. The
whole idea that it should be translated into the vernacular. Wycliffe is one of the very earliest English versions. The Wycliffite version is one of the very earliest of the English versions.
Well, you want to make it available to the people and get it away from that priest class.
Yeah.
That was, his notion was that the priests were an evil hierarchy that was holding men in chains, and that men ought to be set free. And the way to do it was to translate the Bible, because then every man could find out what Christ taught for himself. All of that happened in Chaucer's day. In fact, isn't it the host who, in the middle of somebody or other's statement, says, "I smell a Lollard," he says.
Wind, yes, I smell a Lollard in the wind, and I can't remember
in the
who
wind.
it is. Yeah, in the wind, exactly.
we can go back to the wind. I don't think Chaucer meant that, but that's a good...
I can't remember whether it's the Sumner or who it is.
It's a comment he makes on... It isn't the wife of Bath, it's somebody else, but the host doesn't want those damn Lollards. I mean, he...
Well, they tend to be Puritans, too, and I think that's...
he was talking out against drinking too much or something like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I smell a Lollard in the wind. I forget who he says that about. Some people think that the parson is a Lollard. because he is a bit puritanical. And he was from the peasant class. There have been articles written trying to draw the plowman and the parson into the Lollard camp. But The Parson's Tale is a translation of a perfectly old-fashioned Catholic treatise on the Seven Deadly Sins. There's nothing Lollardic about the Parson's Tale.
Well, the parson is you're talking about poverty, and he is a poor man. And it is true that in general, you don't find very much use for the rich in Chaucer.
No.
The poor, and it's in the tales, and it's in the people themselves.
We might say parenthetically, the knight is a poor man.
Oh yes, he's not.
He's
a
a lord,
man.
but
he's not a wealthy man. No, not at all.
Very simple attire,
yeah.
a good, serviceable horse,
Yeah.
But nothing like the monk who has a horse.
Yeah, beautiful horse.
Worth a million
Spurs, beautiful silver spurs.
And he's a monk.
Bridle and all of that.
Yeah.
No, those are almost certainly signs of worldly attachment in Chaucer. And the parson is the poorest of them all, except for the plowman, I guess. The poor,
and that's
his brother. They have absolutely nothing at all. They're on the borderline of being destitute people.
Some of the clergy, the nun's priest who tells the story of Chantecler, and we'll have to spend at least one more tape on Chaucer, and we'll talk about him. But he's a very poor man, obviously. There are very, very poor people on this journey. But then there are rich people. And I suppose the very richest of them all would be the merchant, who is really treated as a criminal. That is, he's made money by a high-class theft, possibly as making money on pirate ships and things like that. The wife of Bath is a very wealthy woman.
Yes, she's very, very well.
She owns factories. The new economy. I guess I better close that door because wasps are now coming in. I don't mind having spirits of the wind, but my golly, wasps come in, that'll be too much. We do have to talk about the economic order, and the wife of Bath represents the capitalist class. She inherited from one of her husbands a wool business. They're in the weaving business, and I think wool was the first capitalist enterprise to hit England, and she got rich on it. They imported weavers from Flanders and exploited them. It was not part of the guild system. It was not part of the medieval hierarchical system. These people were outside it, and eventually they destroyed it. And her opinions and her wealth and her attitudes are all the attitudes of the new class and the new religion that goes with it. Someone, famous British scholar, wrote a book, Protestantism and the Rise of Capitalism.
Rise of Capitalism, yes. Tawney.
Yeah.
Tawney.
I know there are historians who now say that he's absolutely wrong and there's no connection between the two, but it's an awfully persuasive.
Oh, that's a very persuasive book.
Book to me.
We don't very often recommend other books,
yeah.
but that's really quite a good book. Religion and the Rise of Capitalism.
Religion and the Rise of Capitalism. Yeah. But he means
R.W.H. Tawney or something.
The Protestant
like that.
religion.
And he traces in detail the attitudes toward usury among the various Protestant leaders. Luther took a rather, he wasn't quite clear about his position on it. He changed his mind. Calvin, on the other hand, favored usury and even promoted the idea that somehow your wealth and your success in business was a sign that you were among the chosen people. And you can certainly see that in American Puritanism, for example, where hard work and success showed that you were favored by God. You can find it right down to into modern writers like that guy. What's his name? The one who says the power of positive thinking.
Popular.
Yeah,
preaching, yeah.
a popular preacher of ours, but enormously popular, really enormously popular, who says, if your golf score goes up, you can be sure
God loves you.
because God loves you, you know. But that was the we're just on the other side of the period called the Renaissance. We're in the 13th century, or coming right up to the 1400s and the 15th century, in other words, and you're beginning to see sort of get some dim idea of what's going on in the social order. And one of the things that's going on is this attack on authority itself.
The marvelous, it's very complicated, and we have to take it line by line. The wife of Bath, at the end of her tale, through the lips of this old crone who is transformed by magic into a beautiful young woman, the wife of Bath speaks through this character in her tale, which is just perfect, because she is the wife of Bath's dream of herself. That is, the wife of Bath is an old woman, and she says, if a young man would only come and make love to me, I would show to him that I would be transformed into a beautiful maiden. It's really, really is funny. But through the lips of that old crone comes this speech about poverty. Now, we have to get this straight. The wife of Bath was born poor. She was not a member of the upper classes. Probably her grandfather was a peasant. Somehow or other, she married. She got outside of her father's house, and she married.
Well, she was just a young girl, and she married this
rich
old man. Old man.
She was married off to this old man for no other reason.
She was 12 or 13 or something like that.
Very sad. In many ways, very sad.
Yeah. She did it herself, of course. This is what she wanted to do.
So she got out of her hierarchical station in life, and she got into this class that had no status. That is, there was a new thing that was happening in England. There were people who were making money, but who were not a part of the guild and feudal system. And so she thinks of herself as a poor woman against the rich and the powerful. I mean, she fulminates against the rich and the powerful. Now, she herself is 10 times richer than the knight, whom she hates. And, we find this in American politics. I don't know how it happens in Europe, but who in the United States Senate today is the greatest champion of the poor and the downtrodden? It's Ted Kennedy, who is probably one of the 5 or 6 richest men in the world. But his family were Irish immigrants who had nothing, and he still thinks of himself as a member of the poor. They made their money in the whiskey business, didn't they, or something? I mean, it's a very similar story. You know?
Brickyard. It was a brickyard. They had a brick business.
But it's true of many of these socialist champions of the poor and the downtrodden, that actually they're very, very personally very wealthy people. And the last defenders of the aristocracy frequently haven't got a nickel. The other day I heard on the radio an interview with a man who owns the church where President Bush's ancestors were buried. The present President of the United States. We better get this on tape, because I'm afraid he's the kind of a man who's likely to be forgotten and nobody will ever know that he was ever president. But there's a man who happens at this moment in 1989 to be the President of the United States. And his remote ancestors came over to America on one of the early pilgrim ships. So some reporter got the bright idea of going back and finding his ancestral home. And it's obviously a sensationally beautiful place, as it's an old medieval church, and it talks about the oak beams, and there on the floor the burials with the inscriptions and so on. And he brushed away the dust and found George Bush's ancestor who was buried. And they talked about that. And there was a noise on the camera going all the while the newspaper man or the radio man was interviewing the fellow who owned this place. And he said, what's that noise? Oh, he said, that's my wife. She's cutting the grass. And you realize that he's really a poor man today. That is that the man who has inherited that property is not anywhere near as rich as George Bush, who was a multi-billionaire. It is kind of funny. But I suppose that man has a title. I suppose he's Sir somebody or other who owns that ancestral property. He said, of course, I can't afford this place. I still own it, but we have an agreement with the government. This church has been declared redundant. Have you ever heard that phrase?
No.
And that astonishes me.
No.
He said redundant means that it's no longer used as a church. How did the word redundant ever get to mean that? Through some legal rigmarole. But gee, that's a good word. This church, he said, is redundant. It's been declared redundant by the government, and then that means that I get a little money to help take care of it. He said, otherwise, he said, I couldn't have repaired the roof and things like this. I couldn't possibly have kept it up. Yeah, redundant. That's a good word. I don't know why it is, because it's so surprising. But the point I'm making here about hierarchy and subsidiarity is that you have to look at the facts and not at the abstractions. That is, we talk about, the wife of Bath talks about gentilessa and old richessa. And Chaucer is playing so subtly around those words. That is, the gentleman is not necessarily the rich man at all in a world where capitalism takes over. Quite the contrary.
Yeah.
That is, the Rockefellers and the Fords and the Rothschilds and all those were precisely not the old gentility, who were rather impoverished, most of them.
Yeah. No, they were never rich. The aristocracy was never rich.
Was Richard II even rich?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Is they weren't really rich. They owned lands and they owned castles, and they had
he didn't know.
No, they were not. But if it were a matter of having money, they had no money at all. What they had, in fact, that's the plight of the modern English aristocrat, is that he has this colossal house. But he has no money.
He has to get the government to declare it redundant
in order to be able to support it all, which he can't do, and the taxes are killing him. He can't even pay the taxes on these places, much less make a living for himself. And that's generally true, and it was always true. Not that they were not in a condition where they themselves were poor, but they had really no money at all.
Whereas
they had nothing to worry about, but they had no money.
But the new man has got so much money that it's incalculable.
Yeah, well, they're
I read in the newspaper that Steven Spielberg is the richest man currently in Hollywood, and that in the last 10 years his movies have grossed, and that's a very good word for it. Oh, now I've forgotten the figure. $9 billion.
Yeah.
And you look at a figure like that, and you don't know what that means. It's like Einstein's formula. E equals mc squared. I just heard over the radio. That means that energy equals mass multiplied by the speed of light squared. Now, what is the speed of light squared?
It's a speed that
you can't ever get to.
There is no such speed.
Right. But he says if you square it, then you can convert matter into energy. That way, I don't know what it means. But someone again was explaining that. That is a man like Steven Spielberg, who makes trashy Hollywood movies so bad that you can't believe how bad they are. That man would make all the riches of Croesus look like nothing, I think.
Yeah, you have the spectacle of American billionaires buying castles, buying titles. This is an old thing. It's been going on for 50 years. It's so old. It's a joke in England. American oil millionaires coming over and buying London Bridge or buying
William Hearst, the member, built the castle.
Yeah,
stone by stone. Had it taken over.
Had taken down and brought it all over and built it here. Those are people who have gone out and made their fortunes.
But William Hearst was a populist. He was a ranting Democrat.
Yes.
Against aristocracy and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So there isn't any connection between. It's a totally different economic view, and the wife of Bath represents the new class. Now we're still commenting on the Knight's Tale. I think we only introduced the Wife of Bath by way of contrast. The Knight is an old-fashioned, very humble, very quiet, hard-working, simple man.
Whose whole life has been dedicated to the service of his Lord.
Service. Whereas the Wife of Bath never heard of service.
No.
Never heard of it.
No, she's not in service to anything.
No.
You know,
Not to her
she's a woman who has been married 5 times, and so far as you can tell, she has no children.
No.
For example,
Never mentions it.
never mentions it. It's quite extraordinary. That is, there's no indication whatever that she has ever had a child in her whole life. She's a woman who has been dedicated. Well, she married all of her husbands with the one exception for their money. And she got their money. She killed every one of them, indirectly, if not directly.
And the other one was not for love, but for she lust. I mean,
Yes,
you do have to say.
yes, yes.
She uses the word herself.
Yes, yes.
She says, "Oh, I'm a lusty woman."
Yeah. So she's been in it for the money. We would say she's in the business of making money and making herself rich.
That's something new in Chaucer's day. In our day, it's coming to an end. I suppose, in a way, it's rather a waste of all our time here to fulminate too much against rich capitalists. I mean, because they're on the way out today too. We're moving into an economic order on beyond that today. This is a fight that came in the 14th century, and it went out in the 20th. It lasted about 500-600 years. We're facing a new economic order now, which is against, even against money. We're coming toward, in Plato's terms, we're moving from the oligarchic world now to the democratic world, where even money no longer counts. That is where everybody's equal. In the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, they do state as one of the fundamental rights of man the right to property.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well,
that's gone today.
See, that comes into the United States Constitution by way. Well, it isn't directly stated. That it comes in through John Locke. John Locke talks about the right of property. Life, he says, life, liberty, and property.
Yes,
that's what he says. Now they translated that into life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yes.
But the pursuit of happiness turns out to mean the pursuit of money. That's what it really works out to.
But I suppose we have to say that the anarchist philosophers today have gone even beyond that, so that the Wife of Bath doesn't look perhaps as bad as she seems. I mean, we can look back to the Wife of Bath and say, well, she has some virtues, and we can look back to I won't say Ted Kennedy, but we can look back to Henry Ford at least, and say, well, he had some virtues. Whereas what we're about to move into just now at the end of the 20th century is the next stage of the devolution of economic life, which would move us into a stage which despises property itself, which is a stage which exalts sloth to a virtue. That is the right to be lazy. Karl Marx's son-in-law, I think his name was Paul Lafargue, married Marx's daughter, wrote a book called The Right to be Lazy. Never got as famous as his father-in-law's books, but it's a consequence. I don't suppose his father-in-law liked it. I think in many ways the Marxists are rather ashamed of that kind of a thing, but it's a perfectly logical consequence of what they preach. That is, why not level everything? If a man doesn't want to work, then he has just as much right to live as a man who does. I mean, what is the virtue of work? That is, the Marxists haven't really thoroughly gone to the end of their own theory, I don't think. That is, classical Marxists haven't.
The American hippie movement was exactly that.
I suppose it was Herbert Marcuse or somebody who took up Lafargue's argument and said, well, let's push it all the way. Let's drop out. We have justice. We have a right. And gee, that is absolutely everywhere. Today, we have arguments in the United States Senate over what to do about the homeless. We put it in quotation marks, and we call these people the homeless. And it's as if we had some grave responsibility toward people. Well, let's put it this way. Once upon a time, there were heroes. Odysseus was a hero. In the Middle Ages, the knight was a hero. Well, the capitalist world made the millionaire the hero. That is, from rags to riches. Henry Ford was the hero. He started with nothing, and he ended up a millionaire. He's the hero. Well, the Marxists made the working class, the working man, into the hero. The proletariat, the guy who worked in a factory and joined the union, he was the hero. Well, now we have a new hero, and it's really true. You know, a newspaper, I don't know if you saw this, but in our little local town, which is a town in Kansas, granted it's a college town, and therefore it is a bit exceptional for Kansas, but in Lawrence, Kansas, on the front page of the Lawrence Journal-World, which is our local newspaper, there was a story, and the headline was, AIDS victim